Hello guys, Art-Teeves here. In this video, I'll show you the process of modeling, lazy UV unwrapping and texturing this stylized fantasy tower in 3ds Max 2024, Rizom UV and Substance Painter. Let's get started. First off, a huge thank you for watching. Last week my subscriber count crossed 502 as of recording this video. I'm so grateful for your support. I'm excited to keep growing this channel and promise to keep leveling up my content to make it worth your while. In today's video, I'm diving in how to use the Loft function to model a simple tower. It's kind of funny, this process reminds me a lot of modeling a lighthouse, which is often the first thing many modelers tackle when starting out in this profession or hobby. There is something almost poetic about 3D lighthouses. I feel like so many of us kicked off our 3D journey with one. Now, the trickiest part of modeling towers or lighthouses is dealing with windows, doors, balconies and other add-ons. These details demand careful attention to polygon flow, or you will end up with darker artifacts and topology issues around them. The simpler the window, think basic rectangles or circles, the easier it is to work with, especially if the tower itself isn't curving or twisting. Polygon count is another thing to keep in mind. We don't want to go overboard, especially for props like these, that are just empty shells, not livable spaces for a character to enter. Personally, I think 5k polygons is a reasonable upper limit for something like this, though some might say that's too generous. The tower I'm modeling here sits at about 4.9k polygons, with roughly twice as many triangles. I intentionally gave this tower some curves to show how it connects with the windows, forming the whole structure as a single object. My topology isn't perfect. It doesn't mess up the shading too much, but it's a bit heavy on polygons. If we had gone with a simple cylinder that tapers linearly toward the top and made the windows and frames separate objects intersecting the tower, we could have cut the polygon count by 2 or 3 times. Anyways, let's break it all down step by step. Like always, I've sped up this video by 4 times to keep it from dragging into a dull 2-hour ordeal. If you want to follow along or zoom in on a specific part, just slow down the playback in YouTube's settings. I only trimmed a couple of repetitive moments, so you are not missing any of my workflow. The video comes with a table of contents, speed controls and subtitles to help you out. Let's talk about the tower. Its main body has 32 sides, with 4 sides per upper window. The roof features 8 slopes and 64 sides. I doubled the tower's side count for smoother curves. The slopes align with the windows, so each empty space corresponds to a window. Connecting the 64-sided roof to a 32-sided body is simple using triangles. We collapse every other roof edge to transition smoothly to 32 sides. On a flat surface, these triangles won't mess with the shading. As with many basic models, I am skipping the traditional high to low poly baking process. Still, I am using a normal map, so if you want to create high poly version and bake it onto our low poly model, you'll probably get even better results. If you're great at hand painting textures, you can skip modeling half the details and just paint them onto a simpler base. The tower's shape starts with the roof. I create a spiral and extend it to the roof's base. Then I make a 64-sided cylinder and use its bottom edge to form an editable spline. That spline is our main tool here. Switching to vertex manipulation mode, I turn on soft selection and tweak the curve of our editable spline. This lets me move vertices while affecting nearby ones. I focus on 8 evenly spaced points to define the roof's base shape. You can either keep this shape for the entire loft or simplify it to something like a 64-sided circle, which is what I did. This is the most polygon-intensive part of the tower, since we are building a curve from a 64-sided cylinder. In theory, we could add transitions, like frames or limiters, to cut the side count from 64 to 32, then to 16. But I kept things straightforward, manually adjusting vertices with edge constraints enabled. What's cool about Loft is that it lets you swap objects along the spline's path. You could go wild with intricate shapes or keep it simple like my circle. At the end, I attached a 32-sided sphere to the top and slightly reduced its polygon count. Sure, we could do manual retopology and bake a high poly model onto it, but that takes extra time and isn't always worth it. Sculpting the tower from scratch would be a different story. I know I could have reduced the amount of supporting edge loops on the tower's roof, but this is the most visually prominent part of our model, so it's definitely not the best place for economy. Next up, we are modeling the tower's top platform with its windows. As I mentioned before, I gave it 32 sides, 4 per each of the 8 windows. We could add columns between the windows, but those can be painted on, even in the height map, or left out entirely. 4 sides per window is pretty low. If you are good at texturing, you could paint windows onto basic cylinders. You could even create one window on a cylinder segment with just 4 or 2 sides, and reuse that texture elsewhere. You see this approach in games like World of Warcraft. For my model, I used the 2K texture, admittedly a bit much for a static prop. If you go this route, it's better to group multiple buildings and share a single 4K texture known as a texture atlas. This lets you pack textures tightly and make the most of your UV space. I added plenty of horizontal supporting edge loops, not just to support the window details, but also to give the tower's top the right curve. If it expanded linearly upward, we could cut down on polygons. Simpler rectangular windows could also reduce the count, as curves need extra edge loops for smooth shapes. I focus on modeling one window, knowing I can duplicate it 7 times and rotate each copy 45 degrees around the tower's center. Try to keep polygons near the square. It makes animating the tower easier if you ever want to. Triangles are fine on flat surfaces, but can stand out elsewhere. We could make each window a separate object intersecting a simplified tower, as I noted earlier. That would cut polygons significantly, but bring its own challenges. Don't over-detail the windows. Frame parts can be painted during texturing, and a single chamfer, 3 edges instead of 1, often suffices for upper curves. Consider how your model will be viewed. For FPS games, where players look up, add more detail to the underside. For strategy games with a top-down view, focus on the roof and optimization. Since this is a stylized cartoony model, avoid overly detailed or thin frames. Instead, play with bold, exaggerated shapes. You can always paint in finer details later. Once I'm happy with one window, I duplicate it 7 times and merge the copies into one object. Some modifiers might deform the model, so I carefully reconnect shifted points using something like the collapse modifier. Then I use a series of 4x4 FFD modifiers to shape the tower's top, creating a curve that flares upward to contrast the tapering lower section. I can remove some supporting edge loops and compress the top module vertically to better match the roof. I didn't use a blockout or reference for this model. Not the smartest move, as it could have simplified things, but with enough experience you can tweak details to fit together. You might notice I am building this tower by eye, without specific measurements. That's not ideal. If you are modeling for a game, grab a character from it, place it beside your tower, and scale the floors, doors and windows to match. Otherwise, you might end up with something weird, like a door that's knee-high to your character. The windows and wooden bands get a single chamfer, just like other technical details. Let's clear something up. When I built the top of the tower, I added a ton of supporting edge loops, which isn't great for keeping the polygon count low. Since we are already going all out, we might as well make the most of this geometry, give the tower a bold, almost comical curve, and echo that in the lower section. Honestly, I just loved how the roof turned out and slapped something underneath it. The roof has this nice smooth taper, so I want the top floor to have a similar vibe. I can remove some edge loops and keep compressing the module vertically, along the z-axis, to get the shape I'm after. In the end, I keep just one supporting edge loop cutting horizontally across the windows. The others are there to hold the window frame's vertices in place. In theory, I could surround the windows with rings of near square polygons, but I noticed the current topology barely creates any shading artifacts, so I left it as is. Now we're moving on to shaping the curves of the tower's main body, its foundation, and the door. I decided the lower part should mirror the upper section with a smooth flowing curve. This isn't the most polygon-friendly choice. A simple cylinder tapering upward would have kept the poly count lower. We could also add windows as separate objects intersecting the cylinder to save polygons. I start with a rough blockout, a spline for the tower's height, another for the loft's curve, and an object for the loft made from the bottom edge of a 32-sided cylinder. Then I tweak the tower's height to feel natural and play with the radius of its top and base. Next, the foundation. I create it as a loft along the short spline, using a 32-sided circular spline to match the tower's side count for easy connection later. The loft comes from two circles, one flat for the ground contact, and another I added with soft selection to form a stone-like edge. With 32 sides to work with, I want to maximize their use and give the foundation a bold, interesting curve. For the door, I create a base object, duplicate it, and pull one copy aside. First I cut the door shape out of the main model, then attach a slightly larger version to the resulting opening using the Probylene. I begin by adding thickness to the foundation, so it intersects the tower properly. For this, I use the shell modifier. Then I add a bottom to the tower to avoid weird shapes or geometry issues. Finally, I position the door placeholder object, centering it relative to the tower. Probylene can mess up geometry, so I apply it only to isolated sections where objects intersect. I separate the part of the tower that overlaps with the foundation, then use Probylene on that, the foundation, and the door placeholder. After that, I manually clean up excess geometry and use the target weld modifier to snap newly formed vertices to their proper spots. The foundation's vertices and the tower's corresponding wall vertices are nearly aligned, so I weld any that shifted out of place. Then I refine the door opening to prepare it for the door frame. Since the foundation has several horizontal supporting edge loops, I apply a 4x4 FFD modifier to shape it in line with the tower's upper section and overall style. The key is not overdoing it to avoid foundation clipping and getting too close to the tower's walls. I also add a curve to the door frame. It would look odd if it stayed straight against the curved foundation and tower. I use another 4x4 FFD modifier for this. I considered adding a decorative element above the door, but since the frame is thick, it would have felt too bulky. I attach the door to the opening with Probylene and use target weld again to manually fix the topology. The foundation's edge gets a single chamfer. The best way to handle the door-tower intersection is to surround it with a ring of near square polygons, a solid approach for most intersections. This time I skipped that, since I didn't notice any shading issues. We could still apply weighted normals modifier later, which we will do after setting up smoothing groups. Unlike the frame, the door itself doesn't curve. I kept it simple, skipping extra details and even the dark cavity around it. I painted that cavity and door handle during texturing, and ignored the hinges entirely. The hinges can be handled with texturing. A simple rusty metal texture works, or you could go for something more detailed. Alternatively, just leave them as dark gaps if you are using an emission map to add some glow or contrast. Here's where I messed up. I didn't add a threshold, and the foundation's reserve for intersecting uneven terrain is too thin. This could cause issues when placing the tower in a scene. It is better to include thresholds so buildings can sit on curved surfaces without problems. The door and foundation each get a single chamfer. I want to circle back to something I mentioned earlier. Before finalizing your model, really think about how it will be used. For example, our tower looks great from a distance, from the side or from above, but it is less impressive if you are staring straight at the door or looking up from below. Modern games, especially first-person ones, come with specific expectations. Players don't love getting up close to objects they can't interact with, or buildings they can't enter. It just feels off. As developers, we also don't want to spend our poly count or texture space on non-interactable objects, unless we're talking pre-rendered scenes or optimized background objects that have their textures united into various texture atlases. I decided to give our tower 3 windows, shaped to closely match the door. I created a single window, and once I was happy with it, I duplicated it twice by holding the Shift key to keep the spacing consistent. Like the door, I didn't model the inner parts of the window frames, I chose to paint those details instead. We could have made a high poly version of the model and baked it onto a low poly one, but I went with painting the window frames, door handle, the dark gap between the door and its frame, and some lines wrapping around the tower. Sculpting might have given better results, especially if I were better at hand painting. The windows echo the door's shape, but the bottom edges of their frames got a single chamfer. As I mentioned before, we could have kept the windows as separate objects, especially since there aren't many. They'd intersect the tower, saving on polygon count, and we could even use one overlapping texture for all of them. Instead, I added a bunch of horizontal supporting edge loops to the tower. I used the Insert Edge Loop tool while holding Shift, so 3ds Max respected the existing edge flow. Then I separated the part of the tower that intersected with the windows and the outer window frames, combining them with ProBoolean. After that, I manually fixed the topology using Target Weld, moving vertices and supporting edge loops with the edge constraint function enabled. I placed the central window above the door, creating a spiral effect by offsetting the lower window 120 degrees to the right and the upper one 120 degrees to the left. The tower has a curve, and we want the window frames to follow it, not stick out at straight angles. If we were building a larger scene like a village or a castle, we would likely create compatible models and avoid curving individual windows, or curve them after texturing during the scene assembly. In that case, we'd assemble objects from intersecting elements rather than merging them. With our tower, we could have made each window unique. Asymmetrical models are visually interesting, and fantasy towers look great with a touch of eclecticism. I skipped that idea and now kind of regret it. Before using the ProBoolean tool, I applied a 4x4 FFD modifier to each window to align its curve with the tower's. I also removed horizontal edge loops from the tower that weren't supporting the window geometry. For intersecting objects, it's good practice to surround intersection lines with single loops of near-square polygons. I didn't do that here, since I didn't see major shading artifacts. We're not creating lot groups, so we can use triangles, especially on flat surfaces or where they don't ruin the look. Since the tower and its top both have 32 sides, connecting them was easy with the bridge modifier. I used it for the roof too. All external hard edges, and those at object intersections like the window frames and tower, got a single chamfer. How could we cut the polygon count? First, baking would have helped. Since we are already using a normal map, it could probably halve the poly count. Sculpting could have added tons of details too, likely looking better than my painted elements. We could have kept windows as separate objects, or make them rectangular. Fewer curves mean less supporting geometry. But it is what it is. With such a high polygon count, I probably should have modeled the door handle instead of painting it. The door feels a bit lonely without it. This part of narration is universal, so I'll repeat most of the things I've mentioned in my previous videos. When it comes to final adjustments and checks, I save my model, reset its pivot point, scale, rotation and X-form, set the pivot point to the bottom of the middle part and place it to 0, 0, 0 scene coordinates. Then I use the selection panel to scan my mesh for remaining angons. Technically, you can also remove poles and make sure there aren't many vertices that connect 6 or more edges. Next I used the 3ds Max's XView tool to scan my model for some overlapping or isolated vertices and open edges. In this case, I didn't have any isolated vertices. If there were any, I would have tried selecting them directly. If that didn't work, we'd be dealing with a classic 3ds Max bug. In such cases, I'd attach the model to a newly created box, delete the box, and then fix the model's name and pivot point. This usually resolves the issue of isolated vertices. Finally, I proceed to assign my smoothing groups. Normally, hard edges require corresponding UV splits for padding, but UV splits do not require hard edges. It's generally considered best practice to strategically pair and place hard edges and UV seams along natural breaks in shapes. Normally you can avoid sharp angles and hard edges by beveling or chamfering those edges and going with everything smooth. It means more polygons but less drastic gradients on the low poly shading for the normal map to compensate when baked. To further improve shading on beveled low poly models, you can use weighted normals. My model doesn't have any transparent elements, so I've unwrapped it to a single 2K Reso UV map with a pixel padding of 16. That's pretty generous for this kind of prop, especially considering the fact we use normals but don't bake anything. My model is relatively simple, so I've split my UVs according to existing hard edges and added some seams manually. Next I simply exploded all cylinders and straightened everything I could straighten in Rizom. All the columns and railing supports shall be straightened to receive any kind of stripes texture. We won't be using that for this particular model, however. Basically, if you want to work with realistic textures, you want to unwrap your model much better than if you stick to abstract textures and triplanar projections. At some point, we want to normalize our UV chucks and rescale some of them manually, considering their proportions in comparison to the proportions of neighboring elements. I perform manual scaling to allocate more texture space to visually prominent elements. Conversely, I reduce the size of UV chucks that will be obscured or less visible during typical use. When adjusting UV island sizes, make sure to maintain relative proportions within the same object. It's generally good practice to keep UV size variations within 20% of neighboring elements. Always scale UV islands uniformly per element. Any uneven scaling will create visible seams that Substance Painter can't fix, no matter what tricks you try. I unwrapped this tower to ensure no overlapping UV elements. After placing all UV seams, I simply relax elements and position them horizontally or vertically depending on their location. I mostly rely on Rizom's Optimize tool, O hotkey, and also its straightening algorithm. I could have worked on the UV chunks more thoroughly to straighten them out more precisely. However, I didn't do this because I'm not using photorealistic textures that might be affected. Most stylized materials won't face issues with my UV layout. The key is to avoid any bleeding, which is handled by our pixel padding. Strategic UV seam placement is key. We can either position them along accessible edges for easy Substance Painter repairs with the Clone Stamp tool, or hide them in less visible areas. As an added solution, switching to triplanar projection in Substance Painter typically makes most seams disappear completely. If we were making this tower for a strategy game, mobile game, or a project requiring heavy optimization, I'd consider including it in a texture atlas, a part of a larger model with a 4K texture map, utilizing the space as densely as possible. Additionally, I'd think about making the model symmetrical and stacking its textures to overlap. For example, we could texture just one video model and apply the same texture to the others. When baking my model, I set the highest possible amount of raise on all tabs, disable the ID section, and switch my subsampling to 16. I've also made sure that there were no purple lines on my model or some red fragments. Also, I've selected the option to use my low poly model as a high poly one during baking. My texturing process went pretty lazy. We would get a maximum of this model if we actually hand painted it, but I mostly relied on some simple grunges. Just like I did in my previous video, I also used the free FL Stylized Smart material made by Fred Taylor, which is available at his ArtStation page. I'll provide the link to it in the description. It doesn't do wonders obviously, but it is really nice as a basic custom material that allows you to start playing with gradients, baked light, edge highlights, ambient occlusion and other things without making multiple own fill layers. Overall, I applied an approach similar to the one shown in the excellent video of the Stylized Station channel about texturing buildings in a Studio Ghibli-inspired style. I highly recommend checking out that video if you haven't seen it yet. I have also used the same approach for the Rotunda house in my previous video. Essentially, I start by creating gradients for the walls and roof segments, and all other parts of the tower, then layer individual grunge textures on each. Most grunge textures look too realistic, but we can easily convert them to resemble hand-painted textures by adding a blur slope filter. There is no one-size-fits-all method here. We can hand-paint the model or simulate hand-painted textures in two ways. The first method is the blur slope filter I mentioned. We can adjust the blending options for each fill layer with selected grunge textures and tweak the opacity of each layer. The second method is a relatively new tool in Substance Painter called Stylization. It's great, but not particularly suited for our tower model. I did end up using stylization for certain parts of this model, but not for the walls or similar elements, as converting textures into brushstroke-like effects removes a lot of the detail we want to keep. However, we can successfully combine details we got from applying the blur slope filter to selected grunge textures with the brushstroke look achieved through stylization. Overall, I recommend occasionally applying stylization to see how it affects your model. Remember to block out your colors first and only bring them together when you see a reference image, a pre-made color palette, or your model in general. This is much easier than trying to match colors one by one. I've removed some parts of the video where I pick colors, it took me long enough. It is also much easier to use dark and dim colors if you are a beginner than to properly pick bright ones. Most folders were set up as follows. I created a folder with a material that fills the corresponding layer. The folder received a black mask, and I used UV chunk fill to apply it to relevant elements. Some folders received paint layers. I used them to paint the vines and also some window and door elements. I've included extra high data fill layers into these folders to make those elements stand out. Naturally, I adjusted not only the colors, but also the gradient ratios. I have altered colors, roughness gradients, baked light, and ambient occlusion. Overall, I duplicated the initial folder multiple times, applying it to the elements I wanted to texture. Some received stylization, but only where it was appropriate. Since the objects vary greatly, I tweaked the blending options of the respective layers. Some elements needed to remain uniform, while others required splotches. The general texturing approach for my tower was to apply gradients to all its elements, its roof, the walls, and even the foundation. Some highlights visible in the final render didn't come from my gradient, but from the background environment. I created a near black fill layer with a high roughness value to emphasize the dark outline around the door. If you want your windows and doors to glow, don't forget to assign them base colors, otherwise, when the lighting is disabled in game or animation, you'll see white patches. Make sure to periodically switch environment and lighting settings to see how your model performs under different conditions. Finally, I applied the stylization tool to some folders, set it to a hand-painted preset, and slightly increased the number of brush strokes. As I've mentioned before, I used some masked folders to paint some details like window frames, door outlines, door handle, and vines. Some parts of the vines were actually hand-painted with a lazy mouse setting enabled. I've also used different height data layers for the vine. I applied a few near-realistic preset smart materials, like a wood texture. This material pairs beautifully with the Stylized tool. Of course, you need to mind the texture's direction, rotating its components for parts of the model that call for horizontal or vertical textures. I think this covers everything I wanted to mention. Thanks for watching, guys. If my videos are of use to you, be my guest and subscribe to my channel for more stylized content. And most importantly, have a great day.